Okay, thank you. Morning, everybody. Nice to be here. Seems like a great big hall, all far away at the back. So I hope we feel connected at any rate. So I realised when I was looking at the programme this morning that I'm with some other talks all about assessment. And my talk isn't really about student assessment, it's about us assessing something that we do. It's slightly different. I've put up... The screen has gone dead. It's a bad start. You're nervous and then the screen goes dead. I didn't do anything.
It's a bit early for making the joke about is there any learning technologists in the room? There we go.
Oh, great, thank you. Thank you. Phew, okay. So, what I wanted to share with you today was the work I've been doing over the last few years on my doctoral study, which is about learning design. So essentially, when I've been working with staff in the university looking at developing distance learning and blended learning designs, one of the issues that arises is to do with retention. And so I did quite a big study of what issues impacted on student retention on those courses. And there's lots of research that tells us about the student grade, the... Help. I'll carry on talking because you've seen the slide, it's just an image. So there is lots of... Is this one on now? Is this one on? Yeah? Okay, thank you, sorry. So there's lots of information and research done about the impact on... Thank you. Of students' experience of online learning in particular, the course level, the grade and so on, that impacts on their retention and satisfaction on online distance learning. However, there seems to be a gap where we want to identify the particular impact that our learning activities have. So when we're creating distance learning, we create these great courses with lots of great things for students to do. But all the research that I've found suggested that we talked about and described these kind of learning designs in very different ways. And if we don't have a consistent way to describe these learning tasks or learning activities, we can't then compare courses, we can't use learning analytics data, and we're not talking the same language at all. So these are some examples of the kinds of words that we use to describe learning tasks in the literature. There's a whole load of them. You probably recognise some of them from the University of Ulster project, some are from Diane Laurillard and Grania Connell's work. So what I decided to do, as you do, is to test them out. So this involved gathering some learning activities from some distance learning courses for independent raters, some colleagues at the university, and then I basically asked them to test out the different taxonomies and try them out on the learning activities to see whether they could agree on whether that type of learning activity was a useful term to match to the activities. The first time I did this, it didn't work very well, and I'd persuaded them to come and have coffee and a cookie and whatever. So I said, okay, it didn't work too well, let's try it again. And this time, I'll give you another cookie. And the next time it didn't work, and then they stopped getting cookies because I thought, this isn't going to work at all. And it was then that I realised it really wasn't going to work in the way that I'd been looking at it. But what I found was that there were two terms that we were using that were the most consistently used, that people were able to identify learning activities that included types of interaction or types of feedback. None of the other terms that we saw really worked as well as these, even though this wasn't perfect. So we identified within interaction three types of interaction. Interaction with a tutor, that might be in a webinar and so on, with peers, for example, a peer assessment activity, or interactive content. I'm thinking of a multimedia type of content. And feedback includes feedback from the tutor, feedback on an assignment, so on, from peers, some kind of discussion about your learning, or self, as in a model answer, or automatic feedback from a computer. Everything else went under the other heading. So what this might look like when we identified the learning activities in the course was this. So we might have, on the left, we've got different types of learning activities, fairly standard type, but then you can see we can then start to number them. So we've got a simple coding system for 3 types of interaction, 4 types of feedback, and then everything else. And once we've been able to do that, oh, yes, there we go, thank you. You can see at the bottom that we've been able to do some rudimentary quantification of the learning design. And that's the thing that I think is crucial, really, that we need to be able to describe what we're talking about in ways that we all agree, so that when we are comparing learning designs or comparing work with each other, we're using the same language. Now, it sounds as though that was still going well. I'd run out of cookies by this time, but there were still differences in the way people were using these terms. So I'd like to invite you to try this out. So I've posted a short poll. I've also posted a link to this. I've just tweeted this under EDAT. So if you've got Twitter and you want to try this, it's literally about 4 questions. If you've not got a device, maybe sit next to or hover near somebody who's got a device, then you can see what it looks like. So if you go to Twitter and search for EDAT, I've put the links to the survey on there. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to find that. Apologies, I should have signed in before. This is all the, while you're doing that. Okay, so we've just had 1 completed response so far. Let me just show you what the poll is for those who haven't got a device. There's 4 questions. The first one asks you to rank those different types of interaction that I've just presented you with. So interaction with other students, with interactive content, or interacting with students. Oh, have we gone again? Good job we've all got something to do. Thank you. The second question asks you to rank the types of feedback. And the third question, those who can see it will see that it asks you to think about what each of those terms means to you in terms of how you think of its opposition. So this is an idea taken from personal construct psychology, where we have ways of thinking, and the ways of thinking can be described by what we think of something and what we think of its opposite, or what's in opposition to it. So I asked you to think about, on the survey, what you think is the opposite to feedback, or opposed to feedback, and the opposite or opposed to interaction. Let's see if we've got any more responses. Ah, excellent. Excellent. Ah, you see, this is interesting. So we've got most responses here for interaction with other students is the first one. Interaction with the tutor and interaction with interactive content, mostly ranked in that way. Feedback from the tutor, from peers, self-feedback and computer feedback at the bottom. And then some variety here, which is what we might expect, on the things that people think is opposite to interaction, the highest one being passive, individual learning, and other option, listening and silence. And similarly, feedback, silence, something else, discussion or assessment. Let me just refresh and see if we've had any more. Ah, loads more. Okay. So what we're seeing here is that we've got differences between, first of all, the way that we rank those kind of activities, whether we think they're most effective for learning, generally speaking, and what precisely we mean by them. I would say that there's a difference between somebody who thinks of the opposite of interactions being silence or the opposite of interaction being individual learning. So both of those are quite positive things. So there's a difference there between the two. So thank you very much for that. That'll continue to be open if you wanted to, if you've not been able to do that and you want to look at it later on. So essentially, what I discovered was that the difficulties that we were having in rating or categorizing or describing learning activities wasn't just due to a lack of cookies. It wasn't just because it was too difficult, it was too messy, it was all of those things, but it's also to do with the way we think about teaching and learning, and that we have individual perspectives that will influence the type of activity you think is important and the type of way that you think about that activity. So with the EDAT, the E-Design Assessment Tool, as it now stands, it allows us to categorize learning activities, to then quantify them, so by a simple numbering system of how many we've got of each. We can then use that with analytics to then make comparisons, to evaluate our own course, to compare it to retention data, to attainment data, to compare it with your learner satisfaction data, and then to feed that back into your learning design to say, okay, this is how it worked last time, this is the outcome we got, and we can now review and evaluate the learning design. So we've got literally 5 minutes left of this session, which was for questions, but I'd like to invite you to take a look at one of the final versions of the EDAT, and it's got some sample learning activities. I'd like you to try evaluating it and then to tweet your comments. Essentially, what I'm interested in is whether you think it is possible to categorize learning activities in this way, and whether you think that that is a useful way to analyze learning designs. So I know we've only got a very short time. I've printed out some paper copies if you can't get access to that online version there to have a look at. Very old school handouts I've got here as well. Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes, but if you've got any questions in between whilst people are doing that, I'm happy to take those now. 1 minute? No. No. That's the end of my 15 minutes, is that right? Oh, so I've still got my 5 minutes for questions and people doing, oh, okay, we're okay, guys. Okay. So if anybody's got any questions at this point, or if you're all tweeting. Oh, a question, yeah?
I missed it at the start. When you were saying the people you're speaking to, what sort of roles were they in? Were they mainly kind of academics or services roles or across?
Okay, the people who were doing the categorization, the rating, they were a mixture of people who were educators, some who'd had experience of distance learning, and some who didn't. So it was a mixture of people. This is very loose. There we go. Very dodgy. So yes, a mixture of people, yeah. Okay, I wanted to just now see if we've got any. On the Twitter search. Okay, thank you, nice picture. What's the opposite of feedback? Oh, stop. Okay, are there any other questions at all? Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll be monitoring the Twitter and will reply to any comments or questions that do appear on the Twitter. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for participating in this survey as well. Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah. I've not been able yet to do any big analysis because the tutor perspectives aspect kind of took over what I was doing with the categorisation. But yeah, but that is certainly the next stage, is to start initially doing some initial activities, analysis against rate data. I was able to see quite a clear connection between much more interactive courses, as suggested by these categories, and better retention rates. So yeah, there was some rudimentary evidence there, but certainly something I'll go ahead and look at, yeah. Okay, thank you. All right. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Emma Mayhew. I am normally a lecturer in British and American politics, but at the moment I'm seconded onto the EMA programme, which is a large electronic management of assessment programme that we're running at Reading. I'm talking today with my colleague, Vicky Holmes, who heads the Technology Enhanced Learning department at the university. We've got quite a lot to say, so we're going to go quite quickly. Apologies for that. So what we're looking at today is how at Reading we've moved from quite a small-scale approach to the shift from paper-based marking to online marking, feedback and grading. What I wanted to do to start off with is just to contextualise that a little bit in terms of where Reading is and what the rest of the sector is doing. So what we can see from the stats that I've put on the screen there, from the JISC and the Heads of E-Learning Forum stats, is that almost all universities are looking, as we already know, at moving towards online submission, grading, and feedback. They're making a little bit more progress with the online submission, but certainly with the online marking as well. And in addition to that, if we look at the Heads of the E-Learning Forum, stats from 2016, we can see that that movement away from paper-based towards online submission, feedback and grading is gathering pace. So this is a real issue within the sector at the moment. And of course, there are a whole range of different reasons why universities want to be moving from paper-based to online systems. And I've just quickly listed the most obvious reasons here. So we can see that in terms of meeting student expectations, this is really crucial, particularly because of student experience with technology at infant school, primary school, and secondary school and sixth form. They expect that use of technology to continue. We also have a very real issue with student satisfaction, particularly in terms of the NSS and assessment and feedback. We are mindful about offering students a consistently good student experience, so it shouldn't matter which department necessarily they're in. There should be a consistently good experience. We have got efficiency, time savings for both academic staff and professional staff. Universities obviously do want to maintain a comparable position with their competitors, and almost every university is looking to increase student numbers, so we need to be able to scale up our approaches to assessment and feedback. Okay, so there's a great demand for moving towards online assessment feedback and grading, but obviously there are obstacles, there are challenges in the way for all institutions. I've created a little word cloud here where I've drawn on the concerns expressed by academics and professional staff and senior leaders in universities across the sector, not necessarily at Reading, but just general concerns expressed, and we can divide those into 5 key areas. The first one is change management, when we're moving from paper-based to online assessment processes. That's quite a complicated thing to do in its own right, and of course we're working in a complex organisation. Every university is a complex organisation. We also need to be mindful of the staff experience and the student experience. There are various issues in that word cloud that link to both. We need to think about IT, supporting IT, the functionality of the IT that we have available to us, and also institutional risk. Assessment is at the heart of what we do as lecturers, and students have a lot of experience with assessment. So there's an element of risk when you're making that major change. I'm going to pause there and hand over to Vicky.
Thank you, Emma. So I think we can see that there's a lot of literature around that really made us aware of all the issues that were related around to e-assessment. But I think the challenge that we had was understanding which one of those were relevant for Reading and in what ways they were going to be relevant for Reading. And also at the time for us, we did not have a huge amount of experience. We had some staff who were doing e-submission, but at that point we didn't have many staff who were involved in e-feedback or e-grading, partly because we hadn't made the technologies available. So our big challenge was, how do we move forward on what is a very complex area when actually we're slightly working in the dark and without the right experience to do so? And I think a useful framework to use here was one described by Fullan, which is the ready, fire, aim. Are people familiar with this? It's a very useful way in looking at something where you don't quite know how you need to move forward. So you start off with the notion of ready, which is about thinking of your broad direction, where you want to be heading towards, but you don't necessarily know all the details of how you're going to get there. You then go to the fire phase, where you undertake some kind of intervention where you can understand and learn where you want to be going, and only after that do you then look at the aim phase, where you really understand what you're trying to do. And this model seems to be very appropriate for our situation at Reading. So in terms of the ready phase, we drew up a very broad horizon. We knew what we wanted to aim for, which was the idea that all summative coursework would be submitted online, marked online, and graded online. And we knew that we wanted to look at our organisational processes. So that was the broad horizon that we were aiming for. In terms of then the fire phase, we created a small project that lasted for around a year in 2015 called PAIR, the Project for E-Assessment at Reading. And this was on the surface quite a simple project. There were 2 real aims here. One was that we wanted to require all staff, even those who hadn't engaged with these submissions so far, to ensure that all student work was submitted online. So that would bring everybody up to a base level. And then the other part of PAIR was an optional requirement to engage in e-marking and e-feedback. So this wasn't about trying to bring huge institutional change, but it was about working with individuals and trying to move them forward. So in order to enable this to happen, first of all, we needed to make the technologies available. So we got inline grading, we got Turnitin grade marks, so people actually had the tools to be able to do this. But really what was much more important was how we engage staff, and we spent a lot of time thinking about our communications, making staff aware of where we wanted to head on this longer journey. We put up demonstrations, we really showed staff what the technology could do, what the benefits were, and spent a lot of time offering different training courses, one-to-one support and development, so that staff really felt that if they wanted to dip their toe in the water with this, they could. Now, a lot happened in that year, which I won't go into all the details. It was an extremely busy year, and at times it was quite nerve-wracking for us because the unexpected would happen. But this was part of the fire phase. We wanted to see what issues it would surface, and we knew things would be thrown at us that might be a bit uncomfortable. But in terms of tangible outcomes of what we achieved, certainly we can say that staff did move forward with e-submission, and the rate of increase in which e-submission went forward was very noticeable from the previous year. But I think what was also very pleasing was that although it was only optional for staff to engage in e-marking and e-feedback, actually over half the staff who were using Turnitin, for example, as a submission tool, then went on and used the e-feedback and the e-grading tools. So again, I think staff felt that they could kind of move at their own pace. They were being given an invitation to engage and get involved. And what, in a way, this has left us with at Reading is a much stronger position now, because we now have many staff who have a good foundation of skills and knowledge. And this means they can now engage with us on the future ideas of what we're trying to do. They actually understand now what we're trying to do. They've seen these things working, and they have now got opinions that they can feed back in. So it really has worked in engaging people. And I think one of almost the most unexpected things, but very pleasing, is that some schools actually started to want to develop their own school-wide approaches. So again, move along that path towards a more organisational way of doing things. But as I say, a big part of the fire phase is really to uncover what the issues are. And I think there is a lot that we learnt that, as I say, was difficult to deal with, but has been very helpful in shaping where we are now. So some of the issues that came up. First of all, when we were working with individuals or in schools and looking at workflows between submission and e-marking and e-feedback and recording grades, the differences in those workflows were far greater than we expected. We thought there would be some variation because of disciplines, because of context, but actually the variation was far greater than we realised. And that was something that we knew we had to tackle when we moved forward with this. I think most noticeable of all was where you had some schools that maybe had a very well-developed paper-based way of doing things. Their idea of using the technology was to try and replicate what they did already, whereas in fact those schools who were less well-developed were actually more open to thinking how the technology could help them. So there were lots of subtle differences that influenced decisions. Something else that we've noticed, indeed, that the policies that we have around assessment were very much written to allow a lot of latitude and flexibility, a lot of discretion. But actually then when you're trying to pin things down and you want to refer back to the policy to guide you, they weren't very useful. So it has made us realise that we need to relook at our policies and maybe tighten them up to help support what we're doing with the assessment. Another issue that we found was interesting was around the allocation of roles. So, for example, it sounds very simple as to whether it is one of your administrators who's setting up your submission points or whether maybe it is one of the academic staff. But actually, we noticed that would then influence choices further along the line in the whole workflow process. So again, it made us realise that maybe we need to define the roles and who does what in the e-assessment process more clearly. I'm sure many people have come across this consistency. This was a word that came up so often. We want things to be consistent. And it really made us question, what do we mean by consistency? Is it consistency in that we use the same technology, that we follow the same steps? Or is it about consistency in the outcome, but the steps that we take might be different? And where do we want flexibility and where do we say things need to be consistent? I think this was a huge thing that we realised that we needed to unpack. And I think last of all, really to say that what came across very strongly to us, that I think originally EMA had been seen as something that was an educational or a technological initiative. And for us, we realised actually no, it spread out and it impacted across a lot of other areas in the university. So it couldn't just be thought of simply as an educational and technological innovation. And also, as we thought, if e-assessment involves issues around practices, around roles, around policies, actually, who owns the assessment process? Because we would have arguments with people over who would make changes and who would make decisions. So we realised we need to think about the ownership. So all of these issues were difficult issues, but in a way they have been really important in now helping to frame where we're moving forward to now. And I'll pass over to Emma, who will now tell you how we're moving forward.
So the PAIR project that Vicky has just described achieved a huge amount within Reading in a very short amount of time. But there was a realisation within the senior management at Reading that actually we now needed to move on. We needed to have a much, much bigger approach to EMA with a broader range of people involved and really dedicated towards moving us forward as an institution. So about a year and a half ago, the university decided to put a considerable amount of funding into a larger EMA programme. And that programme has just been, thank you, that programme has just been established. We secured funding in January, so we're now 6 to 7 months into the major EMA programme. This programme is designed to enable a consistently good student experience and to support assessment processes for both staff and reduce the administrative burden of assessment for professional staff. What is notable in particular, if you can see the graphic that I'm looking at, is that a lot of the work that we're doing is not just about the submission, the marking and production of feedback and the recording of grades bit, the bit that you would expect an EMA programme to be actually looking at. A lot of the work that we're doing is actually related to the entire JISC, Manchester Met assessment and feedback cycle. So if you think about specifying, we're working on assessment principles. If we're thinking about setting, we're working on creating a new assessment calendar so that we can manage better the workload of staff and students. If we're thinking about returning marks and feedback, we're now looking and just about to launch much more data available on our SITs, which we call RISIS, so our student record system. We're developing new exam board reports, new moderation processes, and on that crucial reflection piece, there we go, you can see it now, on that crucial reflection piece, which is right at the end of that JISC Manchester Met assessment and feedback cycle, we're developing a new staff-student dashboard, which will include much more data, much more easily accessible data for both staff and personal tutors about the performance of each student in their assessment. So actually the larger EMA programme is impacting on that entire cycle all the way through. And just to finish off, one of the things we wanted to think briefly about actually with our experience with PAIR and this broader EMA programme which is still in its initial phases, alongside the research we've done with lots of other institutions that have gone through the same processes, are what have we learned in terms of planning institutional change? Because this is major institutional change for a university. And we've thought broadly about 5 key principles of effective change management for EMA. We've thought how important it is, for example, to think about vision, a very clear, evidence and achievable vision that meets people's expectations. We've thought about how we need to focus on the staff and student experience, how this needs to be set within the broader context of the university's overall strategy, and how we need to demonstrate commitment from senior management. And just following on for that in terms of justification for moving towards online submission feedback and grading, we need a really good business case. We need to rethink the business case all the way through these kinds of programs to make sure that what we're delivering is what we actually need. We need to be very clear about those institutional internal benefits, but also the external benefits, given the environment in which the university is working, particularly considering student satisfaction and the upcoming TEF. We need to think very carefully about communication. There's a number of universities who've done this very, very well. Sheffield Hallam, for example, in their EMA systems, really good at identifying good practice and disseminating cases. But all the way through, we've seen the most successful EMA change management occur in institutions where they've had a really good, meaningful consultation process with both professional and academic staff, but particularly the professional staff. In terms of resources, EMA change management must be sufficiently resourced, and on a more granular level, we need to think very effectively about training and equipment. And just finally, in terms of planning, we need to think really carefully about an effective approach to change, whether this is organic change, very directive change. We need to think about knowing what good looks like and allowing colleagues perhaps to get there on their own. As Vicky said, impact on policy, practice and culture, and crucially the underlying pedagogy, which is so important for academic colleagues. Okay, I'll stop there because my time is up. So I should now probably have about 4 minutes for questions. Should we start with the purple jumper, I think? Thank you.
Ourselves in our own context. What you were saying, well, why we've been given this kind of sound and light show on the data projector, I may have missed your focus on the more cultural elements. How do you actually work with staff in implementing, in not so much implementing, but in getting people to think about some of the things you said right at the end there? Things like, what's the underlying pedagogy? Why do we do assessment? How does assessment promote learning? Those kinds of issues, because that's the kind of, for me, the kind of nitty-gritty stuff, the cultural shifts, the sort of influences that one might bring to bear on processes that at one level could be seen as largely regulatory and top-down. How do you get to those kinds of levels of engagement with staff? Are there formal processes that you do this through, informal perhaps, which is sometimes more effective, but a lot more intense or intensive?
Yeah. So at Reading, we thought very carefully about the broader communication strategy, but also as part of that and alongside that, involvement of staff within this programme. So this programme, the programme team at the moment is divided up into some external professional project managers and a programme manager, but also we have a lot of academics and professional staff involved in different ways. So there's a whole range of different project boards where we have both of those stakeholder groups represented. We've just got 7 academic secondees working with us. We've got a student secondee just starting today working with us as well, and 2 more coming. So we thought a lot about that communication element, and there's lots of different types of communication. We're having a webinar, for example, next week, and also that engagement. There's another point you're making about the kind of the pedagogy aspect to it. What's interesting about EMA at Reading is that we're quite focused on the EMA. A lot of other EMA programs have drawn together an assessment of feedback project and an EMA project. Sheffield Hallam, I think, have done that, and so they've got that together. There's advantages and disadvantages of doing that. At Reading, we have, alongside EMA, as a separate project, an assessment of feedback project and a curriculum framework project. And they're the areas that tend to look a little bit more at the pedagogy, although we all complement each other. No.
Hello. I come from a vendor. My name is Sophie Emerson. I'm coming from a company, a Norwegian company, delivering an online software for digital exams and assessments at universities. And I had a question on this. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I understand that the project that you've been doing has been a kind of a bottom-up project. This came from within the university. It came from a concern with the pedagogical, the learning aspects of digitizing submissions and digitizing feedback. We've seen in Scandinavia in the past 6-7 years a great movement towards digital assessment and digital examinations. All summative work at higher education institutions, universities, is now digital, more or less. And that has come as a top-down initiative. It's been a push from the ministries of education, from the management of the universities, basically pushing this into the institutions. There's a lot of, there's a lot of experience in Scandinavia on the whole end-to-end process. So all of the kind of larger aspects of digitizing the assessment has been kind of the accumulated experience on that in Scandinavia. I think what you have here is a really, my impression is that you have really done work on the pedagogical aspects and the learning aspects of digitizing assessments. And I was wondering whether you have any kind of interaction between the 2 aspects. I'm not necessarily saying, I'm not asking if you're talking to the Scandinavian universities, but whether there is a kind of a forum with JISC or somewhere else where you can merge those 2 aspects, because I think that there is a lot to be learned on both sides.
There has been a lot of work done by JISC on EMA. That was a few years ago now, and Reading wasn't specifically involved in that process at the time. But we have, as you can imagine, talked to a lot of the institutions that were involved a couple of years ago with EMA. And one of the first things I did when they appointed me as academic director of the programme was to go out and find out what has happened within the sector and learn those lessons as far as we can, so that Reading doesn't repeat them and that we actually can start off from a position of knowledge and understanding.
Thank you.
And I think the point you made as well, you were talking about being top-down and bottom-up, and I think the approach that we've now got is we're doing both.
Yeah.
I think having one or the other doesn't work, and I think coming from bottom-up, as I say, means we now have staff who are very engaged, who are willing to be part of the consultation, and the senior management want this to happen, but now can have those conversations, and I think that's going to make a more meaningful and hopefully more productive work. And we're working with 2 schools at the moment as part of the EMA programme, 2 early adopters, and we have had huge amounts of time they've given us to discuss through all these issues in depth around their processes, around their pedagogy, very willingly giving that time because they feel they're equal stakeholders in this. They don't feel it's been done to them. They feel it's a part of what they are doing and that their voices are being heard. And I think that's really important for the long-term sustainability of what we're doing. We don't want it to be a flash in the pan. This is a change in how we're going to operate from now forward. So it's been very positive. Thank you.
I'm next up to enjoy the fun. Doesn't normally do this, I promise. although it would have been great fun had it happened in Bonnie's talk, I imagine. Yes. Okay, here we go. Hopefully this works. Okay, morning everyone. My name's Peter Austin. I introduced myself at the start. Kind of like the first talk, I want to talk just a little bit about some of the work I've also been doing as part of my PhD studies. And I just wanted to focus on one specific aspect of it, which I think is quite apt, given what the two previous talks have just been talking about, and another one that's coming up next. And it's this notion of e-assessment. And I wanted to look at whether we as the academy are kind of speaking the same language. I think there was an assumption that we all, or when the term e-assessment is mentioned, that we're all kind of thinking along the same lines. And this was just one kind of element of my PhD thesis, which I've been focused on, which I thought I'd come along and just share some thoughts about today. So before I start, I just wanted to take 2 minutes just for yourselves. Don't chat to anyone. I'm not going to ask you, this is not normal, but just what do you understand by the term e-assessment if somebody kind of puts you on the spot right now and says, what does it mean to you? Just take 2 minutes just to write something down or just kind of build a picture in your head of what you understand by the term e-assessment. Because we've heard it mentioned a couple of times already, and we've already heard some of the issues raised around learning design, but what do you understand by the term e-assessment? Okay, so while you're kind of forming out your mind, I'm just going to press ahead and just kind of work up to kind of where I'm going. So the standard stuff, just to kind of set the scene, we're all here because we know technology presents an opportunity in teaching, learning, and assessment activities. That's a big part of what we do and kind of advocating for that and working for colleagues because we know innovative assessment, which technology does afford some opportunities for, it can help to increase student engagement and motivation. But in the literature, again, there's been calls to consider other aspects of kind of looking at e-assessment. And there is this area that I kind of looking at that has this limited coverage in that the language of e-assessment and in terms of what people are actually talking about and do we mean the same things. So the context for this, as I said, it's part of my PhD research. I'm using something called institutional ethnography, which is kind of founded by a woman called Dorothy Smith. Great methodology for looking at institutions. It's about people who are oppressed kind of from the ruling relations from higher above, whether that's through the practices, the cultural norms, the policies. So kind of like what we're all working with now, we often feel we're told to do things that we don't want to do when we want to rise up against them. So I did some interviews with 23 staff at the institution that I was working with at the heart of this study. Range of people across academic and administrative roles, across several departments, faculties. And I was also looking at this institution's documentation as well. And as I said, this is part of a larger study that I was doing to look at the practices around e-assessment. So looking at the enablers and barriers in our roles, but then also how the structures and the formal policies of an institution then either support that or more often than not tend to inhibit the work we want to do. Somebody I was speaking to the other day described us as the mavericks of higher education. We seem to be working against what the institution wants us to do. And I wanted to kind of get to the heart of that. Just looking at what the literature says about e-assessment, it is commonplace for lots of different technology-related practices to be referred to using different terms when we're trying to mean the same thing. And Sim and Holyfield and Brown noted that this lack of consent has been around for a long time. So in the literature, you kind of see all these kind of terms referring to around e-learning or anything to do with online learning. But people often tend to think that they all mean the same thing. And the same is true of when we're talking about e-assessment or electronic assessment, that again, there are a number of different terminologies. I imagine for thinking about what you wrote at the start, maybe one of the terminologies or the description you came up with will probably fit in with one of those that I've put up on the screen now. But the idea is we're all thinking about it from a different perspective in terms of what we understand by e-assessment. And actually, if we went to Google, even Google had two different answers at the time when I was doing this research. So I do have the slides if anyone wants them, but just to give you a summary, on the left-hand side at the start of doing this, I searched for electronic assessment. And the first hit at the top was the EMA project. On the right-hand side, I search for e-assessment, E with a hyphen. The top entry is electronic assessments. So you've already got two instances of where it's potentially being defined in different ways. One is actually describing it as an electronic assessment, and the other is saying it's a process of assessment that involves technology. Which one is right? So it was kind of around that I wanted to kind of look into as part of my studies. Well, what do people actually understand by e-assessment then when we're working with it in institutions? And again, if just referring back to the literature, this was the one I'd kind of used as the definition for my thesis. From Thomas Borg and Neil, they talk about e-assessment as this umbrella term for the use of ICT in mediation of assessment. But for me, again, that notion of an umbrella term suggests that there's lots of different right answers for this. So we're working from kind of different bases. So I wanted to look at what was the reality. What were people who were working with electronic assessments, what did they understand by it? So again, a point back to I interviewed academics and professional services staff from a range of different roles across the institution that I was working with. For those people in a professional services role or administrative, they tended to see e-assessment as a method of assessment. So it focused on the students. It was this kind of real-time completion of some kind of online test or the submission of a piece of work. So the emphasis here was a method of assessment. Switching to the academics, it was a slightly different perspective. They can't agree on anything, which is no surprise there, as a former academic myself. Some people tended to think it was that process of assessment. It's something that I do as an academic. I assess my students. So in this case, they were seeing it as the tutor focus, that there was some element of a human being involved, and technology was being used to mediate my ability to assess students, so to mark and to give them some feedback. On the other side, some of them also saw it as this automation, so it's the electronic assessment, so the technology is actually assessing the piece of work. So not as far as kind of artificial intelligence, but makes an online test, so something that maybe an MCQ quiz, something that can be automatically marked, but then also give feedback. And then we have a different set of people who kind of actually bridge the gap, which is where I'm kind of leaning to, is they actually described e-assessment as the process. So they were actually referring to the kind of the latest stuff around electronic management of assessment. So e-assessment is about this whole process. So that kind of got me thinking, is we've got all these different people that are interacting together and not one of them, or we can't come to a kind of collective decision about what e-assessment actually means. So no wonder we're struggling to kind of work within the structures and the policies within an institution, because everyone's working from a kind of a different hymn sheet. So what's the implications for practice here, in terms of working forward? So there is, I've missed out that one. So there is some consensus with this benchmark definition about it being an umbrella term around using technology to mediate, but actually the variation wasn't anything to do with the technology. It was about how people interpreted the term assessment. So it's going back to our understandings of kind of terminology. Is it the assessment of students? Is it the assessment of student work? Is it the whole assessment process? And it got me thinking about this kind of role of how academics and professional services and administrative staff kind of work together. And actually, a colleague, Julie Vocci, was writing about institutional policy, and that the role of professional services staff isn't necessarily recognised in any institutional policies around e-assessment. It's mainly focused on the assessment process. Ergo, a lot of people think it's focused around the academic perspective. But what in reality needs to happen is that we need to be more collaborative to help kind of facilitate this innovation. And to bring these together, these fragmented aspects of understanding, to try and get towards a more holistic and less conflicting approach. So in part of the reading, I came across Celia Whitchurch's paper that talks about the third space. I don't know if anyone's heard about it, but it's this notion of where people kind of crossing the boundaries to work together. So at the institution I was kind of working with, it was very binary. You're either an academic and had this kind of elite status that Bonnie was referring to at the start, or you're a professional services member of staff, and you're not necessarily maybe viewed in the same light. You don't necessarily have that status and that knowledge to be able to contribute, but we rely on the professional services to provide our infrastructure, to run staff development, to kind of help people out with the kind of how to use the technology. And the divisions often come from the language that's being used within institutions. And again, there's been lots of attention paid to the academic identity within institutions. And Tony Beach and Paul Trowell have done quite a lot of work on that about the academic tribes. But there's been less emphasis on professional services staff, and for those people whose role tends to blur the boundaries between the two. So that was kind of me in my own practice of where I was before. So this is where we kind of talk about this third space, people who kind of, or roles who kind of bridge this gap between professional and academic spheres. And it's not necessarily reserved for one specific discipline, function, or activity or role. And what the literature says is that these people actually are involved in management activities, and they're a mixture of professional and academic. However, in the institution I was looking at, these people who occupied this third space weren't in positions of power. They didn't have that opportunity to make influence, which was one of the comments that was just been kind of mentioned there. How do we actually take these things forward? And Kem talks about how the roles and the importance of these people in these positions aren't necessarily fully acknowledged, these people who bridge the two gaps. So who am I actually talking about? Well, it's the people who are the learning technologists, the people who are policy administrators, people who are content developers, media specialists, and me, when I was in my former role as a lecturer in learning technology here at the University of Liverpool. I was bridging that gap between the academic sphere and the learning technology sphere. But there wasn't necessarily any weight attributed to kind of the work I was doing. It wasn't necessarily recognised for its importance and so on. And what you actually end up with is these kinds of feelings of disempowerment that academics think you're stealing the kind of the rights and the responsibilities of being in charge of an assessment. They think that's been taken away from them. And then professional services staff, again, feel like that this notion of interloping, they're kind of being these pretenders. Are they supposed to be in this sphere? Do they feel like they actually have that credence to have these kind of these relationships with the academics? So in terms of, for successfully assessment, some of the findings that will come out just from this specific aspect that I was looking at, I was referring to Whitchurch's kind of three stages. She talks about the contestation, reconciliation, and reconstruction. So contestation is about recognizing there is a problem. The reconciliation is about kind of moving forward and how you can work those practices. And then the reconstruction is then kind of bringing that all together. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize from this was this, that she doesn't actually talk about it, is the role of language. We've already seen at the start when we were talking about learning design tasks that people define things differently. And there's often that assumption that when we're talking about electronic assessment or online assessment or learning technology, that we're all thinking of the same thing, but it's not necessarily true. So one of the things, as I say, I wanted to kind of get with this is recognition of the multitude of roles that are involved, thinking about the language that people are actually using that's in commonplace, and do people actually understand what it is? Don't forget we've got maybe academics who really focus on their subject discipline research. We've got these kind of people who cross that middle boundary, and then the professional services as well. But it's that recognition that we all need to be thinking along the same lines. And then the final point is that, again, thinking about this third space and people who operate specifically within it, is not just an acknowledgement that they exist and the token gesture of, yeah, we have people who are learning technologists, but the real importance of the work that they play, because they often feel that they're not as kind of, they're not kind of given the same credence as their academic counterparts, when they're often working alongside them to develop that assessment, to think of new pedagogical ways for delivery that pretty much involve technology. Thank you very much. I know they're really small, but if you would like a copy of the slides, please do feel free to ask me. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and I'll take any questions if anyone has one. Yep, completely agree. Yeah. I think just on that, the danger is assumptions, people assuming that we know what we're talking about. And it's almost like, I won't say the elephant in the room, but you're an academic or you're a professional member of staff working in an institution, you should know what this means, and that expectation that people are keeping up to speed with this sort of stuff, when in reality it doesn't necessarily happen. Do you want to?
Higher education context for a long time, that perhaps they understood the terms differently?
There was one specific anecdote that I can give from an academic who'd been in teaching for about 20 plus years. And when I was kind of talking to them, and I'm going to be very specific, I'll try not to mention gender. When I was talking to them, they were kind of talking about how they made the transition from writing on paper to writing digitally. And kind of in terms of where they felt, it was around that e-assessment is about me assessing the students. And their kind of take on it was, well, it took me 5 years to make that transition from kind of moving from paper text to kind of written digital text, and I don't think we can expect students to do it straight away in there. And I was like, well, just because it took you 5 years to maybe make that move, doesn't necessarily that's going to be the same for everyone else. So I think length of service didn't necessarily completely have an impact on how people understood it. Certainly, the faculty in which people were located and the role in which they adopted had a massive impact on it. But some of it was maybe a little bit around of, I would say, ignorance, resistance to change, about what Bonnie was talking about. I've done this thing for the past 10 years, it's not broke, so why should I do anything to change it? So it wasn't necessarily on that, it was more about the position where you're located and kind of who you interacted with. If you didn't really interact with anyone outside the faculty, then you had that kind of very limited scope, but those people who tended to go a little bit more outside, then that's when the variations did start to occur. Hope that answers the question. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, and now thank you very much for that.
Okay, everybody. Just a slight change to the programme. I'm not Richard. I'm in fact his colleague Ben, and I'll be delivering the talk today. I think the angle we're going to take on this talk is going to be very different to the previous three talks you've heard, because we're actually based in the Central IT team at the University of Essex, and we're going to be talking about 10 years of electronic submission. Obviously, we're in Liverpool. We tried our hardest to get a Liverpool gag in, but the Beatles didn't really write many songs about EMA. So, to give you some context, both USISA and the Heads of E-Learning Forum have run surveys in the last 2 years looking at electronic management of assessment. And the conclusion is largely that most universities have a tool to allow for the provision of EMA, whether that's embedded in their VLE or if they're using a cloud-based service such as Turnitin. The number who are actually using that, university-wide, however, is a lot lower, and the number who are using that as their sole submission method is lower still. It's a similarly grim picture with electronic-only feedback and return. Now, for the University of Essex, we've actually got quite a high figure. Over 70% of our coursework is submitted electronically, and we know that that 30% is largely ineligible for an electronic medium. Of that electronic coursework, 98% leads to electronic feedback. So you might wonder why we're particularly high. And it's probably because we built our own e-assessment tool. The University of Essex has a habit of going it alone. We developed our own student record system back in the 80s, and many of our services are made in-house. To give you an idea of how vast this service is, we've had over 1 million student submissions in about 10 years. So just to give you a quick overview, this is the screen that we've developed for students. As you can see, a student logs in, they see an idea of the deadlines on the left and an idea of the feedback they've been given on the right. Most of these elements are interactive, so a student can click on them, and in this example, they are given some guidance on their deadline. So some submission guidelines and when they have to submit by. And then finally, we've got our standard statement of authorship with a little bit extra that I'll go into. And down at the bottom there is a file that a student has submitted. So if anyone's used an EMA platform, this is fairly run-of-the-mill. Although I did note recently on ALT that there was some discussion about having an authorship statement for turned it in. So over the 10 years, what have we learnt? We've learnt that students don't read. We have students submitting late. We have a training assignment for all students. So we say, here's an assignment that you can try out, but by the way, the coursework won't go anywhere. And we have at least 15 cases a year where a student comes to us and says, oh, I've accidentally submitted to the test assignment and not where I'm meant to. We have students submitting the wrong file format, and we have students accidentally deleting, despite there being quite a large on-screen prompt saying, this will permanently delete your file from our servers. Students have surprisingly low digital literacy, and also not in the areas you would expect. We have students in computer science, for example, not optimizing file sizes and submitting massive files which would make something like Turnitin choke. Students, quite obviously, will leave things to the last minute, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. And so what we try to do is we try to design some of this out in service delivery. It hasn't always worked, but I'll come on to that. But the key thing is we've never refused a student submission. We've only tried to steer them in the right direction. So we're going to play a little game, which we call Submission Chicken. So I've got 4 graphs here, and these represent bell curves of submissions over time, with the rightmost side being the deadline. So I just want a show of hands of about the 50 of you in the room if you think it is A, the blue curve, a kind of normal distribution. Okay, no one. B, which is the kind of widow's peaks of submission, very early on and very late on. No. Okay, C, which is a kind of gradual progression. Okay, and D, which is everyone leaves it until the last minute. Right, okay, that's pretty much everybody. You are in fact right. This is a graph representing our submissions over time. That line there at the rightmost end is the assignment deadline as it falls, and most of the submissions will be in the last 48 hours, predominantly in the last 24, most of them in the last 2 hours, almost all of them in the last 2 hours. And I talked about designing behaviour out. This graph occurs wherever that deadline is set, whether you set it 12 noon, 3 p.m, 12 midnight, or 3 in the morning. You will see a rush of students in the last 2 hours. So in designing it out, we've said to departments, okay, you can only set deadlines within office hours, because if a student can't submit at 3 a.m, they're up at 1 in the morning doing this, and nobody's there to support them if something goes wrong. This is looking in the last sort of 20 minutes, and that spike there is the last closing seconds of an assessment life cycle. So the other observation we made is that students view the technology as infallible. When we spoke to students and said, why did you leave it to the last 30 milliseconds before uploading your file? They said, oh, well, I thought it would be instant. And again, these are students who are on their home internet connections, and they're not realizing that they've made a Word document with pictures that make the file 75 megabytes because they've put lots of unoptimized images in it. And they're just saying, well, I thought it would be instant. I didn't know better. I do have some feeling for the unfortunate soul who missed the deadline by 3 milliseconds at the other side. So, looking at staff side of things, we've recently rewritten the service, and one of the things for staff feedback was they were just saying to us, I just want to be told what to do. So we've now given them a kind of Facebook for Academics feed that says to them, here's an assignment that's about to end, here's an assignment that needs feedback, here's an assignment that needs publishing to students. And again, if they click on one of these, they're given a further breakdown of how many students still need feedback, how many students still need a mark, who's submitted late. And we've made all of these elements clickable so that the academic, can click on that and get into a filtered view of those marks or those students, as we can see here. So here's a list of students, the feedback they've been given, the mark, and because we've fully integrated this service, this mark goes straight into our student record system, and then some other toggles, such as making the mark visible or not. And finally, here's some detail on some annotation. Occasionally, we haven't written everything. This is farmed out to a service called Crocodoc, and it enables us to do some features we wouldn't otherwise be able to build ourselves. And I'll come back to Crocodoc towards the end of my talk. So staff. Staff, when we spoke to them, we realised that they're up against stricter deadlines than students. They've got research, they've got teaching, they have policies and so on. And because of that, we've often found staff more critical of our service delivery than a student. If a student has to wait 10 seconds or 30 seconds for a page to load, they'll say, oh, well, it's only one a day, I'll come back to this, it's fine. Whereas a member of staff, if they're having to mark a class of 500 and waiting 30 seconds each time, you can understand they can get quite frustrated. There's also the case for digital literacy, and again, it wouldn't necessarily be in the areas where you would expect. This leads to edge cases for support. So we've had a case where a member of staff has spent several weeks of us trying to get to the bottom of an issue where their annotation was offset from where they were putting it on the page. And we eventually realised that they were zooming their browser rather than using the zoom buttons that zoomed the annotation tool itself. We also find that academics kind of vent frustration at us and the service for what are often university policies and procedures. And I'll come back to that a bit later. And so in all, we found that staff probably need greater support than students in delivering electronic management of assessment. So again, another question for you. I'm guessing that most of you run some degree of EMA in your institution. Have you ever had hands up, just if you've ever had a member of staff come to you and say, this tool's great, but it would be greater if it did X? So out of 50 of you, roughly half the room has said that you've got staff who want your service to do more. And we're no different. And unfortunately, we can't hide behind well, that's what we've bought from Blackboard, sorry. We have to listen to these people. And sometimes it doesn't work. So we've had members of staff get quite frustrated about data entry. I think in one of the earlier talks there was talk about repetitive strain. And so we've had staff say, actually, it would be great if I had audio feedback. And so we built that for them. 5 years later, looking at that data, in the 380,000 items of feedback returned to students, 0.1% is audio feedback. But that's something we've taken time to build, to develop, and maintain each time we upgrade the service. Again, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem if we'd got an off-the-shelf package and just went, sorry. We're also under pressure from institutional policy. So we're kind of the victims of our own success, and over the years, the institution has said, this is a great tool, we want everybody to use it. This is a great tool, we should want everyone to use it for feedback. This is a great tool, we should do away with paper. The interesting one there is, this is a great tool, we should get everyone to give feedback within 28 days. And so we looked at this. We looked at it and said, right, okay, how feasible is this to implement? And this is the graph of the volume of feedback given in relation to the coursework deadline. In most cases, it falls within 14 days. We've got some crazy outliers which I've moved. But what we discovered is that people were giving feedback before the deadline. In some cases, this was so they could pre-populate assignments with SPSS data files, and we're actually using it, a sort of emergent behavior from a tool. But in other cases, we discovered that departments were changing deadlines at the last minute, midway through academics giving feedback. And academics were giving feedback before an assignment life cycle had ended. So we spent several months going down a rabbit hole and developing tools and having meetings of unexpected development to try and go after academics with a stick to say, why are you doing this? Again, unexpected work. So I'm just coming to the end of things now. What I would conclude is that users will be vocal if a service isn't perfect. And actually, if you're using something off the shelf, it might be like I was shrugging my shoulders and simply saying, well, Turnitin doesn't offer that. Blackboard or Moodle don't offer that. But you also have to balance those individual wishes with the needs of the university. And it can get quite difficult, it can get quite political, particularly when people have this level of change imposed upon them. Doing this isn't cheap either. We estimate that we spend something about £75,000 a year maintaining our own in-house system. But we've had minimal downtime over 12 years. I'm sure you're all aware of an email from a certain company, at least once a year, saying, I'm sorry, but the service is down for a little while we look at it. We've also been able to integrate fully with our student record system so that marks, deadlines go between our VLE. We inject those into student Outlook calendars. We haven't had any unexpected surprises. I'm aware that several of the sort of subcontracted products we've used, such as Crocodoc, have gone out of business and been bought out during the life cycle of our tool, but we've been able to weather that storm. And we can also explain how that magic box works, so when students have, say, academic offence issues, we've been able to side with the students and say, no, we agree it was a technology problem, or no, we agree they submitted 3 milliseconds too late. So, we think it's worthwhile. The University of Essex is still committed to its own in-house tool. We think it unlocks several other things in the future, such as learner analytics and tighter integration of university processes. The next 3 years will be interesting. Thank you. Any questions? No, great.
John Kerr from the University of Glasgow. Do you have plans to increase the use of audio-visual feedback? I know you mentioned audio, but it's starting to show that the audio-visual aspects are starting to really grow within the sector. Is that developments that you're looking at?
It's incredibly early days. We've had kind of corridor-based discussions with academics who've gone, yeah, that'd be a great idea. And we actually have Panopto as our lecture capture system, so we are looking at ways of exploring that into assessment. So kind of, but only in theory. There's 2 questions there. I'm aware that everyone also wants to get to lunch. Okay.
Hello, thanks for that. Linda Craner from Glasgow Caledonian University. Can I ask you, and this probably relates to previous presentations as well, alongside all the development work with staff and development work with the systems, what have you done about the staff equipment? Because that's something that's come up for us recently when we're trying to do the same thing. Have you made sure that all staff, for example, have either 2 screens on their desk so they can mark online easily, or a large screen, webcams, all that sort of thing?
We haven't actively done it. We do know that our standard desktop build now includes dual monitors. The bigger pressure we've been under is to actually support mobile devices, things like tablets, phones, and touchscreen interfaces, rather than something like dual monitors. There was one there at the front.
Now I've forgotten my question. Well, I was going to say, I was just going to ask if you could talk a little bit more about the future of the audio, because it strikes me as one of those things that might suddenly happen almost overnight when somebody very influential takes it up and shows how effective it can be in certain situations. And the other thing was about the learning analytics and how you saw that developing. Are you waiting for a big institutional funding injection or a strategic turn, or do you have plans in that respect? Because it sounds like it's going to be relatively straightforward for you to do that.
On the audio front, we know it's there. We're not going to switch it off, and we have had huge uptake in other features where I talked about those pressures from above. So we've recently taken a much more active role in accessible and inclusive feedback, and so audio feedback could be raised through that, but we are still only seeing it bubble along. And for learner analytics, we are just starting a learner analytics pilot at the university. We've had a lot of manual data extractions done, and people looking at that data kind of for academic exercises such as this, but no one's really plugged it into analytics yet. We're looking more at, did the student meet the deadline, were they late? So it's very high level overview.